It's now, I think, more than a year ago that we posted our first videos on this channel. And this was initially because Fai, a producer, suggested I read The Moral Landscape by Sam Harris. And then we posted this video and we got a lot of responses, but we never really got to respond to the responses. So much belated, we're going to do this today. By far the most criticisms by viewers were about a supposed paradox, namely that they said by criticizing morality, by somehow indicating that morality is bad, I was making a moral judgment and thereby contradicting myself. One typical comment here by Nathan Paulson: if you don't believe in morality, then why are social conflict and violence and all the things you criticize moral discourses for a problem? So, once more let me explain this. I basically agree with Sam Harris that the quest for well-being, both individually and collectively, is an important quest that both the sciences and philosophy can dedicate themselves to. However, I disagree with Sam Harris that this quest is best being described as moral, just as I think it's not best being described as religious. It's simply a quest for well-being. Now, violence also can be understood as not primarily immoral or sinful, but as not increasing well-being. For instance, obviously violence often causes bodily pain, it causes mental stress, and it causes social dysfunctionality. The basic idea is, just as we can drop the religious framing of, for instance, violence or anything else that doesn't increase well-being, we can also drop the moral framing of it. Violence is neither against God nor actually against moral principles, but in most cases it does not increase well-being. Just to give you an example of an amoral conception of goodness. For instance, if a doctor says smoking 20 cigarettes a day is doing violence to yourself and decreases your well-being, therefore you'd be better off if you would smoke less or stop smoking altogether, if the doctor makes such a statement, she actually neither makes a moral nor a religious statement. And just in the same way, I think we can philosophically emphasize well-being or de-emphasize violence without being moralistic or religious. Nevertheless, people still seem to have, if not a strong religious faith, some form of moral faith. And that seems to be difficult to overcome for viewers like Nathan Paulson, who just cannot see how a defense of amorality isn't moral at the same time. And apparently Sam Harris has exactly the same problem. They just cannot see how a statement against violence is not at the same time also a moral statement. So this shows how powerful still the use of moral language is. I think just as people who grow up in a highly religious environment find it very difficult to understand anything without relating it to God, we, growing up in a heavily moralistic environment, find it difficult to understand anything, or a lot of things at least, without seeing them in a moral register. I like the following comment by Zachary Hershberger, which I think describes the form of relief you can experience once you somehow free yourself from overly religious or overly moralistic frameworks. I'd like to quote Zachary here. "It's the specific contradiction that drove me out of religion. God and morality were too fixed and immediate. Nothing I did mattered or could even matter. I was so young it produced a traumatic impression, but I've learned a lot in overcoming it. Reading philosophy was instrumental in bringing me to a healthy mental state and eradicating the eternal no, as Nietzsche called it. So again, I think he describes wonderfully here what happens when we no longer see everything and judge everything, or at least a lot of things, in terms of their religious or moral value or meaning. And how in this way we somehow overcome moral faith. And I think that we've actually existing amorally in a lot of social contexts. For instance, we no longer apply religion or moral faith in, I already referred to this example, in medicine, right? We no longer see people who are sick either as being punished by God or as somehow morally responsible for their sickness. Similarly, and I gave this example in the first video on Harris, in education, we also no longer treat bad students as bad people. In the economy too, we, at least more often than not, I hope, also do not view poor people as morally bad. And at least hopefully in politics too, we are capable of seeing the political opponents not as morally bad, but just as maybe politically bad. Unfortunately, of course, a lot of problems arise when, for instance, in politics, we switch to a moral coding of political differences. Even in law, I think there is a tendency to move away from moral coding, from moral language, from moral framing. And I mentioned the case of divorce law, where we also no longer try to find out which of the two partners is guilty with regard to the breakdown of the relationship.